My name is Stevina Evuleocha. I'm a professor in the Department of Marketing and Entrepreneurship in the College of Business at Cal State East Bay. Um, I think I'll start from the very beginning. I think my childhood probably informs a lot of what I now do in adulthood. Even though I grew up in an upper middle class family where my parents emphasized that I needed to go to school, and that was the only job I had. So I didn't have to worry about cooking, going to get water, or doing any household tasks for that matter, because according to my father, there were people who were to do that. My father was an entrepreneur and had a variety of businesses, and later in life became a politician. My mother was a school teacher, and the values that I picked up growing up as a child, even though in this upper middle class family, I was not, I did not get the sense that just because I had people doing things for me, that meant that I had any power over them. Even though I was class conscious, because society clearly divided people according to their status in life. In my home growing up, as kids, we were told that it just meant that somebody else did the work while we're going to school, but it didn't mean that we were better than them. So that stuck with me, because even people who lived in our house and helped us at the time later on got to be trained by my father. They were sent to school. They also, if they wanted to start a trade, he assisted them with those kinds of things. So that was my childhood. And, I always like to tell people that perhaps one of my first ideas about diversity probably was not in my household as a kid, because my father did not discriminate by gender. In fact, I always was told that whatever my brothers could do, that I could do, and do even better. So I was never conscious of the difference between me and the next person, regardless of their gender. However, as I grew up and now went to school, went outside the house, interacted with other people, those kinds of things began to filter into my worldview, because all of a sudden I noticed things about people, either because of the way that they speak to me or the way that they interact with me. And so I noticed those kinds of things. Then fast forward to me coming into higher education. My bachelor's was in African literature, and I actually remember being in the classroom and learning about African literature, and learning also alongside African texts and African scholars who were a little bit of militant, in the sense of having militancy in their work, whether it was poems or stories. I did my thesis, my bachelor's thesis, clearly from the streams that I got out of these pieces of work. So my comparison was between Mejawange's Kill Me Quick and The Native Son, which is clearly an American work. And basically, the comparison there was also about social class and class consciousness. But those are all sentiments picked up in that initial training. Then when I came to do my graduate work, my graduate work was in international affairs with an emphasis on development and African history. And I also remember that training also exposed me to development literature, which in most instances talked about the haves and the have-nots. And so all of this consciousness about class and race and all the divisions that existed in society began to emerge the more training that I got. So I completed my graduate work, and at the time, some of my nuances about diversity really were about just making sure that in whatever role I found myself, that I made sure that I projected that my difference did not stop me from achieving. And if it also involves having to advocate for someone else, then I'll do it. So when I arrived on this campus 24 years ago, in the fall of 1990, I remember thinking, wow, there isn't any diversity on this campus. But I was not far from the truth, because Cal State East Bay, formerly known as Hayward, didn't have that presence of faculty of color, students of color. In fact, the university at the time struggled with retention of African American students, especially African American males. Except it was almost the chicken and egg theory, where it didn't seem like everybody got it, that if you were to recruit more faculty of color, then invariably students will see people that look like them, and there wouldn't be that urge to, take off and not graduate. But we did discuss this in committees and talk about, the need to hire more faculty of color. And I remember back then serving on the Faculty on Diversity and Equity Committee, and these were some of the topics that we constantly addressed. How do we recruit more faculty of color in order to make sure that our students stayed when we recruited them. And then, of course, campus initiatives such as having the FDEC attend to issues of diversity, and also having the Super Sunday, which started a whole lot later, that was targeting minority communities, especially black churches, where we went to take the message that Cal State East Bay was open for business and was recruiting minority students. So now in 2015, you could walk around campus and comfortably say that there is a minority presence. And that East Bay, which is the campus that clearly reflects the population of the greater East Bay, could be said to be approaching equity in terms of being an actual reflection of the community that we do business in. So, going across personal, professional, I think you can see how progressively you can look at how your thoughts grow and how your values may change based on the exposure. And of course, initially when I got here, there were other things that affected how I thought about diversity and social justice, because clearly the College of Business is a very, very different area, and people have perceptions or stereotypes about what is obtainable in a College of Business. Clearly because the assumption is that, business drives what we do in society. So when I got here, I remembered when I started as an adjunct faculty. And I had just had my first child before coming here. So she was barely 6 months old when I started working here. Then subsequently I would have a child in 1991 and 1995. I went all over campus trying to figure out what are the campus rules for maternity leave. Nobody knew anything. And I kept thinking, surely there's some female faculty here. Surely some of them had babies at some point. What happened? Nobody could tell me. HR didn't know. If the university, my department had no clue, and nobody could answer that question. So frustrated, I said, okay, well, clearly Cal State East Bay doesn't have a maternity leave program, so I'm just going to have to fend for myself. And if it wasn't for the fact that my spouse also taught in the same department, I don't know how I would have handled those times, except maybe somehow to not work and not have money to be able to raise these children that I was bringing into the world. So I actually had to make an arrangement in which my spouse would cover my classes for a few weeks until I was fit enough to come back to the classroom, and then I would come and take over my classes. So you can imagine my excitement when during the Clinton administration the Family Leave Act was passed, because people like me heaved a huge sigh of relief for people who would come after us. So it really was no surprise to anyone who knew my frustrations about these issues that in 2001, when I now was having child number 4, I said, you know what, I'm taking every leave that is due me. I took a sabbatical, and at the time, because I had been informed by the HR coordinator in the College of Business that I was entitled to maternity leave finally, I took both maternity leave and sabbatical for 6 months just to feel as if I had those entitlements. So these are issues which, although personal, reflect clearly some of the issues that people deal with on a daily basis. And of course, when you come to the fact that business is a discipline that is considered to be conservative, in reality, people don't realize that business drives a lot of change and should drive a lot of change. And later on, I guess, in our discussion, I will indicate how some of that change should come with business being the leader in that capacity. I remember reading Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which he talks about essentially what we struggle with today, which is, how do you teach in the classroom? Are you going to spoon feed students? Because Paulo talks about the banking model in teaching, which makes it seem as if you teach students as if you're feeding coins into a piggy bank. So spoon feeding, in essence, but he uses an analogy of a banking model and a piggy bank, as opposed to perhaps having students participate in the development of knowledge, which to me, even though he doesn't make the reference immediately in his original definition of that pedagogy, you can see that it means that learning is a two-way street where the instructor brings knowledge. That knowledge is debated and discussed, and everybody learns from the process. So even as early as when I started my career in academia, I always knew that the classroom was not a place where I dominated. And the reason for that was everybody who was coming to my classroom was coming in there with the sum total of their experience, their life stories, which would inform everything we did in class. So it wasn't just a one-way feeding. And I always tell my students the first day of class, this is not a one-way street. It's going to be an interactive session. You will participate and prepare yourself, because I'm not going to be the only one talking, because that's not what education is about. It's a classroom environment where we're always going to enrich ourselves from what we do. And so when I start to talk about things that are happening in corporate America, and I tell my students, yes, we will talk about constructs, theories in class, but we're going to bring in your stories, because some of you are working professionals, some of you are aspiring professionals, but all of these things will inform the rich stories that we'll tell in the classroom, so that when you do leave the classroom, it's not going to be all about the theories you heard in class, the constructs. It would also be about you being able to bring the knowledge to focus on what it is you're doing outside of the classroom. So some of the first things that I do initially to also get this going is to tell my students that, because the business world of today doesn't allow people to work in an individual capacity, they have to form project teams. Now, you have to remember, a lot of students kick and fight about it. Oh, the best work I do is the one that I do by myself. And that's all well and good. The problem there is the class model already says that you have to work in a project team. So here is one way that you could survive 8 to 9 weeks of a quarter with 5 people you don't know, but you'll get to know them by the end of the quarter. So their task the first few days of class is to form a diverse team, a diverse project team, and they're given instructions how you make this team. What are some of the kinds of things that you're supposed to do? Your team must not have all American people in it. It must not have all males or females. It must not have all people from the same continent. So once you have been able to check your team for all those requirements that you have been given, then you come back and report, yes, I have a diverse team, because one of the things that I say to them is that my aim in this class is to make sure that you understand that when you get into the workplace, that you're going to meet the same spectrum that you see in this classroom. So you don't want to go out there and have a culture shock. Start now. Let this be your lab. Practice what you're going to be doing out there. So I'm not creating a fairy tale for you, because eventually when you get out there, the workplace looks exactly like this classroom. And it doesn't really hit a lot of them until they do go out there, because I do get feedback from a lot of students who write me, send me emails, or call and talk about things that they're experiencing that mimic some of what we talked about in class. So my aims generally when I teach business with the diversity and social justice objective is to make sure that students understand that it is not busy work. What we're doing is a reflection of what is going to be obtainable when they get out there. And to the direct extent that they're able to apply what we're doing in the classroom and remember it, then they can go out there and actually practice it. For example, I know that one of the things that we do say at the beginning of the quarter is that the class has accommodations for students with disabilities. And yes, the syllabus would announce such a thing, but clearly there is a law that protects people with disabilities. And later on, when we get into subject matter and discussions and students bring up those kinds of things, I tell them that yes, the law does say it, but it is also good business practice. Even if the law didn't say it, if somebody didn't have legs, let's say they were a quadriplegic or they had some sort of deformity, but their brain, the information that they bring to the table with their brain is useful to the organization, is there no reason to harness that particular aspect of that individual? And of course, in the affirmative, they will say yes. So we talk about those kinds of things, and we say, note that diversity in and of itself, if not practiced well, does not do anything. Diversity is really being able to mine the kinds of values that are brought to the table, the kinds of ideas, knowledge that are brought to the table, just by virtue of the fact that people come from different cultures, they have different persuasions, they think outside the box. But it doesn't mean that occasionally you won't have people who are diverse, who think the same way about a specific issue. Occasionally that would happen, but I always want my students to know that there is richness and there is value in diversity, because it's been proven out there. Oodles of research has exactly indicated what we are arguing, which is that diversity is good for the health of any organization. When we talk about successes, I think for me successes come from the actual activities that we use to indicate what diversity means and what social justice means on a larger level. And I know that in one of the courses I teach in corporate communication, there is no getting away from social justice as an aspect of the course, because clearly one of the modules in the class is corporate social responsibility, which falls right into the area of social justice. And then in my business communication class, for me, I find ways to insinuate diversity and social justice, even though clearly the modules do not specify that you can do that. But I use case studies. I make up case studies and use it to explain concepts in class. For example, there is an actual example I use in class in which I ask my students. There are two, and I will discuss them in relation to how they affect the business environment. One of them is that I ask my students if they can think about a time in the history of business where people were not sure how to respond to a customer. And usually they are wondering what does she want? What does she mean by that? And I keep probing and probing and probing. Then if I don't get any response that is satisfactory, and I tell them a story. And the story that I tell them is that somebody comes into your store and you're in retail, and this individual, as far as you know, based on how they looked to you when they came to the counter, they were female. And they're asking to go try on some lingerie. You happen to work in the lingerie department, and they're asking to go try on some lingerie. Your hunch tells you this person is not female, but everything on their outside says that they're female. How would you handle that? Oh my gosh, my students go all over the map. Some of them say, "Oh, I'll go, I will go stand by the door and have them use the dressing room." But of course, we're looking at scenarios, because some students will say, "But if I send them to the women's dressing room, I'm probably going to panic everybody." I said, "Well, how do you know?" Didn't they present to you as a female? They say, yeah. So why would you discriminate against someone who presented to you as a female? Clearly, your goal is not to ask them, are you really female? Your goal as someone who's providing a service is to look at what they present to you as. The law says that. And so you can't go and say, oh, I'm not sure and I don't want to panic the people out there. Well, right now there are not business processes that have addressed that, except in maybe a few retail chains where they say, well, we have one androgynous dressing room. You can go in there if you're male or female and it doesn't matter. But not every store has that. For instance, if you go to Macy's in lingerie, it's always going to be in the women's section of the lingerie. So if somebody who perhaps works in an industry where they have to cross-dress shows up there, are you going to violate their right to purchase appropriate wear for their job? Or are you going to say, well, hey, look, I'm going to put them in that dressing room because clearly they presented to me as a female? And I get all kinds of stories that students would tell about that. But that's consciousness, being able to say, hey, are you aware that this person has the same right as a person who walks in clearly biologically female but doesn't have any issues that you have to question them on, because you will immediately direct them to the dressing room, but all of a sudden you have a reservation about this individual. So I use that example in class. And then we talked again about, occasionally this comes up because we talk about how we now come to where a lot of businesses have family bathrooms. That wasn't always the case. I remember clearly being in bathrooms, at whatever outside environment that I was, and maybe you're busy minding your own business in the stall, and here's a little boy looking under to see who's in the next stall. I mean, many, many times, even before I even had a male child. And I can't imagine that it's easy for, someone who's a mom with a son to go into the female bathroom with their son. You can't tell the 2-year-old sit still, because, that's what 2-year-olds do. They move around. So the family bathroom was a response to a business need. And clearly, the role of business is to make sure there's equity. The role of business is to make sure there's diversity of opinion, there's diversity of values, diversity of presentations, and choice, not only for the customer, but for all the different constituents of business. And even as we talk about, there's an offshoot of business that addresses this exclusively when we talk about social entrepreneurship, which addresses really doing business and also doing good. But it shouldn't be one section of business that does that. It should be all sections of business. That's why we have equal opportunity employment laws that say that an employer should not ask you certain questions because they violate your rights as someone who's applying for work. So there are so many tangents we go into in the business communication class that also address this whole issue of diversity and social justice. And when I ask my students, are you aware that the law protects you and prevents you from answering certain personal questions in an interview? A lot of students don't really realize that. And without that knowledge, a student goes for a job interview and someone can trample all over their rights because they have not bothered to go either to the EOE website or find a book that says what are the questions that an interviewer cannot ask you. So, but these are realities confronting students who are in business, and if they leave the classroom, they will be exposed to those kinds of things, and we talk about them quite frequently. To get to where you asked me, so for me, those successes are usually celebrated when a student, I get the reward when a student calls me and says, I went to an interview today and they asked me this question and this is how I handled it because we talked about it in class. Those are actual, successes for me, because then I know, yes, they got it, and now they can go out there and implement what they heard in the classroom. But to talk about how maybe some of my colleagues in the system have participated in helping me to think the way that I do. I remember quite early in my career, I served on the writing skills subcommittee that reviewed the essays that students would write for the WST. And the first time that I attended a meeting of the committee and I saw the list of essays, I couldn't help but think, wow, well, not all students who take this test are going to know what these topics are. And here's why: because culturally, some students have no idea what some of these topics are. I'll give you a clear example. The first committee meeting I attended, there was a question in there that students were to answer that addressed K through 12 education. Now, in a lot of countries all over the world, there's no such thing as K through 12. And here we know our campus is busting at the seams with international students who are coming from all kinds of countries that have no idea whatsoever. So if a student were to sit down and write on that topic, because that's the only one they feel they can write on, they have no clue what they're writing about. So at the time, I served on that committee with the Dean of Science, Dean Leon. And I sort of spoke up because I said, I don't think these essays are fair to some of the students who are going to be taking this test, because if they don't know the topic, they have no idea what the topic is about, they're not going to be able to qualitatively address the questions. Lucky for me, my colleague Dean Leon spoke up again, and we both were able to persuade our colleagues to see the sense in making sure that the questions were vetted for being universal in nature, or topics that students from everywhere could easily address. So I've had those kinds of successes with colleagues, and at the institutional level, just like I said prior, being a part of Super Sunday, which was clearly an institutional project, was very satisfying to me, because I remember thinking, wow, if for every church I went and made a presentation, just one student comes to Cal State East Bay and graduates, that would be something. It would be a major success compared to not just participating. So at that level, I believe I appreciate what the institution has done, and it was very uplifting to read recently that the facilities department on campus has now come up with a number. I can't remember if it's 13 or so bathrooms on campus that are non-gender specific. Clearly those are some of the issues on our campus that if we don't address, nobody will address it for us. So on an institutional level, there's quite a bit of work that is left to be done, but clearly some of the steps to go do them will require people to do some of the things we're talking about in diversity and social justice in their classrooms, and also be the voices that speak out very loud about them. It's an imperative. I think we stay in our own isolated disciplines, and we don't see the way that these things work. I fail to see that there's any discipline in which diversity and social justice does not apply. And I think tiny steps really count. It doesn't require a major disciplinary overhaul. It's looking at your discipline and seeing what are the injustices that I can address, even if it is just at the curricular level. Once you sensitize students, sensitize people, either to your research or through the work that you do in all kinds of environments, that will take off and clearly help others. It's unintended consequences of something that you're doing, clearly to help others. But you never know who would be a beneficiary of something that you're doing in a curricular format, because there are, I don't want to use the term invisible members of our community, but it is the only term to use, because these are people who feel marginalized for whatever reason, feel that no one pays attention to their needs, and that invariably the system is not fair to them. And I think when you think about social justice on a global level, universal level, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly outlines a lot of rights for humans. If anyone takes time to go and read that document, it's full of many imperatives that lots of countries are not even paying attention to, let alone at the level of an institution. What all people have to do is take some time and see how, from a disciplinary perspective, they can gradually inject elements of diversity and social justice into what they teach, and to then see how that particular initiative can grow over time. Clearly, there are people doing things in every area. Most people will never think, hey, social justice, anything to do with business. But clearly, business is a driver. It's a big driver, because without business, there is no employment. And without employment, people don't do anything. But even as I talk about the different disciplines on our campus, we all have to be aware, for instance, that even if we're doing it at the individual level, where we acknowledge the fact that every student that comes into our classroom has a different background than we had, and that we ought to be able to be empathetic about whatever their classic situation is, then we would have done a little bit to address the issues of diversity and social justice in our classroom. But I think it's a very worthwhile initiative, and people need to consider doing that.